All right, so we have the author of the book that you guys just read, David Shell, with us today. So we're going to have our Q&A session now. So if you guys have questions, we're going to use this microphone here, this red one, which is called the catch box. And you can throw it, right? You can throw it. So I can just like throw it out to them. And then they need to talk into the... Okay, and if they need to talk in the black part, right? And then ask your question into the black part so that Mr. Shell can hear you. So if anybody has a question, thank you for being here, Mr. Shell.
Oh, you're welcome.
And if anybody has a question, raise your hand and I will throw the red box at you.
Oh, it's easier to catch. Hi.
Hi.
So when I was reading the chapters, there were a lot of point where what you were describing in the story is textbook example of theory in family therapy. And so I was wondering if you could share more about that.
In particular, you're...
I'm referring to one instance that I was seeing it is in chapter 8 about the wedding invitations. It's such a prime example of triangulations.
Well, you know, that's kind of the whole, you know, point of the book, and kind of why you're using it as a companion to your textbook, is that this is kind of the stuff, you know, that the things you're reading about in your textbook, this is the stuff that, you know, really goes on out there. And so, you know, there wasn't, when the book was being written, there wasn't attention paid to, you know, specific, you know, technical terms and things like that. It was just written, and then not by coincidence, you know, that it just kind of coincides with the things you're learning about, because that's, you know, really what goes on out there. Does that answer your question?
It does, thank you.
I'm going to throw this to you. You ready?
I like that mic there.
Yeah, it's pretty handy.
Okay, so in chapter 3, it kind of talked about how your distance with your dad kind of made you not feel seen. But then I was just kind of more curious, or just how like feelings like from your parents like make you not feel seen. But how did distance with your dad, with like a father figure, specifically affect specific mental illnesses, I guess, and how can and mental stability?
Oh, I think there's so many intangibles to those primary relationships, you know, be they, you know, father-son, father-daughter, mother-son, mother-daughter. You know, there's so much bonding, and it affects so many parts of your life in ways you don't even realize. And I think, you know, there's that level of confidence. There's that, you know, there's that self-esteem. There's just your sense of self. And it's amazing, you know, because as you're growing up, you kind of don't know what you don't know that you don't know. And you're kind of learning as you go. But gosh, we're all kind of wired to belong. We're all kind of wired to have those primary relationships. And even if you don't know what you're missing from like a technical textbook type of standpoint, you feel it somehow. And you feel it and, you know, you obviously see it in your peers around you. You can see what, you know, your peers have that you don't have. And so that stands out to you in a variety of ways. And so, you know, when that, like I said, in this instance, when that father-son relationship, you know, is a tortured relationship, or kind of doesn't exist, or exists at arm's length, you know, it just goes to the core of who you are and who you become, and it certainly can't help but affect you.
Hello.
Hi.
So just reading the individual short passages that we did read, personally, it was very moving. I really could feel for Gil and for Deborah. And so I wanted to know, since it's such an emotionally charged novel and there's a lot of feelings that go into it, what were the most challenging parts for you as the author to write such an emotional piece?
Oh, that's a very good question. You know, as I was just saying, there's so many intangibles that go on. You know, and one of the things in the Deborah Gill relationship, and Julie, I'm not sure if they're up to this part in the textbook yet, but so have you guys kind of gone through shared environmental experiences and non-shared? Okay.
We're on that chapter.
Gil and Deborah are gosh, kind of textbook examples of, you know, they had so many non-shared environmental experiences because they grew up so different. And yet they had so many shared experiences because they grew up kind of, you know, a part of the same dysfunction. And so that dysfunction almost is what was the only bond between them. And no matter how many times, I don't know how far you've read in the book, no matter how many times Gil and Deborah try and have this relationship, there's just always something missing because it just didn't get cemented early on. And so they were trying to kind of recapture this bond constantly. And when you don't have that bond from the start, and when, you know, they got separated the way they did, it's, you know, it's so hard. You're kind of building this relationship on quicksand. And so that every time Gil and Deborah would kind of turn a corner and be able to have a relationship, something that probably would not undo a different sibling relationship kind of undoes their relationship, and they kind of go back and forth. And so I think that the challenges in the Gil-Deborah relationship were kind of that bridge between these shared and non-shared, you know, experiences, and trying to kind of create that bond where the bond didn't exist, but it did exist to some extent. So does that answer you?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
I kind of wanted to know whether or not if the book was a biography about you or if it was just tied in with certain personal experiences that you may have had.
That's a good question. It was based on the actual events of my life. And I would say, you know, a large part of the book is kind of accurate to that. And you know, there's some creative liberty taken in there, but to a large extent, the book is an accurate portrayal of my life.
Oh, she's typing.
Actually, throw it. It won't hurt it. There you go.
So I just wanted to know, were there any things that you felt were holding you back when you were writing the book, or any things that you wanted to hold back? Like, were there any barriers or things that you felt like you didn't really want, like you wanted to add them, but you didn't, like you kind of second guess yourself on it? Like, was there anything like that for you?
That's an excellent question. I think in writing the book, I think it was hard to, you know, because while the book is you know, it's on the large side for a novel, and, you know, trying to kind of pick the scenes, and, you know, there were probably, you know, 50 other scenes that could have been in the book that there just was no room for. And so it was really difficult trying to, pick the scenes that would convey the message. And so while there wasn't a direct message to the book, there really was. And so trying to kind of pick which scenes are going to convey, you know, it's hard. I mean, when you think back on your own lives, you know, the past, you know, say 18 to 20 years, I'm guessing in that classroom, you know, it's hard. So many things happen that shaped who you are today. And to try and kind of pick which ones would really illustrate your life story is definitely challenging. But there was not, you know, so there was nothing that held me back from putting anything in. It was really trying to figure out what's the best use of the space you have to work with.
Thank you.
How did writing and publishing the book change you as a person and your relationship with your family?
That's a really good question. It was, very, very, therapeutic and very kind of releasing to write the book. One of the parts of Gil's life was constantly this need to keep secrets. Like I said earlier, we all have this need, this desire, this want to belong. Whether you want to belong to your family, belong to your group of friends, belong to whatever kind of social clique, so to speak. And it's Gil spent much of his life, trying to kind of hide things so that he would fit in. And again, because you kind of go back to this book, and this book started out in the 1970s. So this book started out, 50 years ago. And it was a different time then, a much different time. And the way kind of divorce was treated, in society. And so, Gil started out in this pattern of kind of trying to hide all the various parts of his life and continued that on into adulthood. And then, so for me right now, it was really freeing to be able to kind of tell this story. And for me, just seeing the impact that it has on people of your age and all across the country has really been just really fulfilling and really rewarding for me. And I think that's probably the biggest reason I wanted to write the book. I didn't want to write it just to write it. I really wanted it to be impactful and have meaning.
There was a part in chapter 3 where it kind of talked about how Gil's mom, the way that she kind of talks about the dad's spouse. Do you think that the way that parents may talk about like their ex's family or their spouses would change the way that teenagers may feel or children may feel about them?
Again, another really good question. And I think there's a fine line there. And so kind of, just on its surface, yeah, I mean, if one spouse is talking about the other spouse or the other spouse's new spouse or whatever, it's kind of like almost kind of goes without saying that, okay, nothing good's going to come from that. Yeah. But at the same time, and here's kind of where the fine line comes in, is that one of the things that kind of goes on for parents in divorce is that they feel constrained to be truthful with how they're feeling. So, your parents might, talk to you about someone else in all of your collective lives, and they may be honest with you about what they feel about that person or as part of your learning and growing and experiencing different things. But then all of a sudden there's this kind of person that's off limits. And so on one hand, yeah, nothing good's going to come from kind of talking negatively about, the new spouse, et cetera. But on the other hand, if you're not being truthful, then you're not having an honest relationship with your kids. And again, there's so much focus, so much preoccupation with a parent on trying to shield their kids from all the kind of crap that's going on. And again, that's a good thing, but then you're having a less than honest relationship. And so trying to find that fine line, and boy, it's not easy to find, is probably the best place.
Yeah. Thank you.
I know you had talked about how like children were treated in like families of divorce. Do you think it would be different growing up in like a single parent household, like compared to being a child of divorce?
So single parent as in, so there was never, there were never two parents in the equation?
Yeah.
Okay. I guess, that has its challenge. Again, you don't know what you don't know. And so on one hand, yeah, there's a lot of kind of crap you're not having to deal with, but there's a lot you're missing as well. You see your peers, and so if your peers all have two parents, and you have one, then that's a challenge. If your peers have two parents that are divorced, and all the back and forth, and that's a challenge. So it's so hard to say. I mean, obviously, ideally, a parent with, a child with two parents in the same household is certainly the most desired for any child. I mean, it just is. And as you start kind of deviating from that, it's hard to find, what's best, what's not best. Obviously, you can have a situation where, a parent died when a child, was an infant. And so the parent never got to know that parent, but there's a difference there. That parent will always kind of be revered in that child's life, even though the child never got to meet that parent. So there's so many different kind of, unique circumstances, and it's so hard to, I've been asked that question several times, and it's always a hard question to ask, because you don't know what you don't know.
Okay, thank you.
Throw it? No?
Okay, so we didn't really get to read the entire book. So I was just wondering where your title came from, because it's Without a Chair, and I'm sure it's probably explained somewhere in the book or something like that, but I was just wondering why the book is titled Without a Chair.
Well, that's another good question. Two reasons. One is kind of a little take on the game of musical chairs. And so kind of what happens, in this kind of divorce culture that has developed over the last half century, there's so many situations where, say, parents get divorced, and, child or children are living primarily with mom, but, they see dad, but just not as much as they'd like to, or not as much as, as anyone would like. And so let's say kids are with mom 80% of the time. And so they see dad 20%. So now dad goes and remarries someone else. And so now she has kids. And so now he's living under the same roof with her kids. And so now there's a father there who is only seeing his kids 20% of the time. And now this man's now stepfather, and he's seeing her kids 80% of the time, and his own kids 20% of the time. And so it gets into this whole kind of game of musical chairs, that kind of just creating new families and new situations. And, somewhere in this whole thing, we've kind of, again, in this last half century has kind of been this booming divorce culture. And so what ultimately happens is, somewhere this just kind of doesn't work out for everyone. Somewhere it might work out for mom and dad and their new spouses, but somewhere it doesn't work out, for all the kids. Not to say it doesn't work out for kids, and in plenty of situations where it does, but someplace kind of someone's losing. Someone's kind of without a chair. And then the second meaning to it is just as you're building your life, as you're building all the parts and all the things you'll go through in this adolescent development class, that kind of all these things that take you into adulthood. If you're kind of missing some of these things, you're kind of not going to have a chair with four legs. You might have a chair with three or two, or you might end up kind of without any legs, and the chair falls over, and you're without a chair in that regard. So all the things that, you've kind of just gone through in your own adolescence, all the things you're learning about, they're so critical for how you go out into the world as an adult.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Hi. I just had a question. Looking back and after publishing this book, is there anything you would change or add to it?
I've often, there's, like I said, there were a lot of scenes that could have been in the book. And there's a lot of scenes like I wish were in the book. And so, yeah, and it took, almost 5 years to complete the book. And yeah, there's probably things I would do different, probably this scene or that scene, but in the end, this is kind of the way it came together. And like I said, there's just, if you look back in your own life, there's just so many things that occurred, between the time you were born and today. And to try and kind of write your life story, there's just a lot of things that would have to get left out.
Great, thank you.
So the book has a theme of the consequences of divorce. And so on your website, there's like a pre-marriage 10-hour course for couple going into their first marriage. And I kind of wonder if you could like to tell more about what those courses entail, and if the course involved discussing like the negative side of divorce.
Sure. That's, you're referring to legislation that I had created and written and sponsored called the Marriage Education Act. And, just like you're sitting here in a classroom today learning, obviously, you all want to go out into the world and, do whatever it is you want to do. And obviously you realize that education is a key component of that. Some about getting married doesn't require an education. And yet it's, probably the most important thing you'll ever do, and theoretically it's supposed to be forever. You're going to go out into a career and you're probably not going to stay in the first job that you have forever. You're probably going to have a handful of jobs along the way. And so, I believe that education is the key to anything. And there are just certain skills in a marriage. There's communication, there's expectations, there's financial issues, there are intimacy issues. There are so many various things. And nobody teaches you. I mean, yes, in some instances, your parents model it for you, and that's wonderful. But not everyone kind of has the benefit of that. And even when parents are modeling it, it's different. Things are different generationally. So what, kind of worked in your parents' generation may or may not work in your generation. So just that concept of learning, and part of that legislation is that people would be free to learn through whatever kind of ideology they want. Everyone has, there's no exact way to have a marriage. There's whatever works for the two people involved, and whatever kind of, and each two people are their own unique relationship. So it's just kind of putting some conceptual teeth to the issue and really trying to create a successful society. I mean, right now, like I said, we've watched in the last 50 years, the marriage rate has declined to the point where there are more people not getting married than getting married. There are sociologists right now that predict that in the next 50, 60, 70 years that marriage might become obsolete. If you believe that that's a bad thing to happen or not a great thing to happen, then, let's kind of educate people and let's get people a little better equipped. And so if people, I think part of the reason for the decline in the marriage rate is that people have seen the divorce rate, over the last half century. And so if you can kind of create a more successful group of people, there still are plenty of people getting married. And if you can create a more successful group of people, then more people want to become a part of that group, and more people would not be afraid as they are today to become part of that group.
I'm gonna throw it. Hi.
Hi.
This might be a little personal, but we also didn't get to finish the book quite yet. But were you able, either like during the process of the book or after publishing and everything, were you able to have a relationship with your family? Like, did you have a more positive relationship with your family? Like, were you able to mend anything throughout your life, considering this is based off a true story?
No. Unfortunately, that kind of hasn't occurred, and you never know. You never know what the future will bring, but it hasn't occurred to date. Interesting, some extended family and things like that. And actually some relationships that some distant cousins that I hadn't kind of seen in years, that kind of helped and kind of rekindle relationships in that regard. But the primary kind of relationships, no, and unfortunately, just so much damage kind of had been done. And like I said, you never know what the future will bring, and hopefully there can be some healing in the future. And please ask anything you want. There's nothing too personal. Ask anything that's on your mind.
In chapter 7, I believe, when you visit your grandfather at the hospital, and it was said in the book that Jill took personally that he thought that he was the reason that his grandfather died. Was that like actually true in a sense, or was it just being like creatively just?
No, that was true, and kind of like I said, going back to one of the first questions here. So again, when you're not developing, emotionally the way in a productive, healthy, progressive way, and you're not kind of developing the way you should, all of a sudden, that's how kind of, when someone had asked, again, one of the first questions, how does that kind of contribute to mental illnesses and things like that? And all of a sudden, you're not able to look at things accurately when you haven't kind of been shown things accurately. And so, yeah, Gil, was it Gil's fault that his grandfather died? Obviously not. But in Gil's mind, wow, hadn't seen Grandpa in ages, goes to see Grandpa, and within 24 hours, Grandpa has died. Absent in Gil's equation there is that Grandpa was in the intensive care unit of a hospital, and he was old. And so, yeah, I mean, from an intellectual standpoint, yeah, Gil had nothing to do with, his grandfather's passing. But emotionally, Gil, again, it's that kind of, there's that kind of typical thing where a lot of kids, and whether they're cognizant of that or not, blame themselves for their parents' divorce. So all early on, Gil starts blaming himself for a lot of things that aren't his fault. So now by extension, okay, he sees Grandpa dies, must be his fault. And so you really start to develop, in Gil's case, a very unhealthy sense of self, that really has you more powerful than you are in certain situations, and less powerful than you really should be.
I think that it's important that kids should have both parents in their lives, but if there's a circumstance where that can't happen, do you think in situations like this, it's better for a male, the boy, to go with his father and the girl to go with the mother, because certain things a mother can teach a boy to do, like to be a man. She can teach him some things, but there's a lot of things that she probably can't teach him that a father can. So do you think that that's kind of important? It has like a big role to play with becoming a woman and becoming a man?
I think that's unfortunate. I think that's an unanswerable question on the global kind of level that you're posing the question. I think each circumstance would be unique to itself in that regard. And I hear what you're saying, and yes, because at the end of the day, yeah, there are certain things that a son can get from a mother that he can't get from a father. Certain things a daughter can get from a mother can't get, and vice versa, can't get from a father that can't. It's so hard to just kind of make a kind of global answer to that. That's a really hard question, and I think that's one that just kind of has to be unique unto that circumstance. Because all fathers aren't created equally, all mothers aren't created equally, all sons and daughters. Everyone's wired different. Everyone has certain strengths. We all have certain strengths and weaknesses. Father A may be really strong in this and not so strong in that. Father B, different. Father C, mother A, B, etc. there's just no kind of global answer, but I hear what you're saying in your question. I wish I had a better answer.
So in the book, we see that like all of Gil's childhood was just filled with unstable situations and emotions and relationships. And like knowing from the premise of the book that Gil finds himself in a psych ward later in his life, does that experience or like other life experience, does that result in Gil or you finding any stable outlets like faith or another relationship, or are there like parts of Gil's and your life that end up more stable and positive?
That's a great question. I think as I kind of look at it after this whole kind of story and what have you, just what we're doing here today, I mean, that is the greatest outcome that comes from the life experience, to be able to all of a sudden sit here and if one of you kind of goes down a different path than you otherwise might have, then that's a success. And so, yeah, I think, what I tried to do was, I woke up, pretty much one day I woke up at 50 years of age and say, okay, why is this topic has forever been in my life? Why won't this topic go away? And then I just kind of turn, okay, well, what can I do productive with it? Where can this topic has really kind of wreaked havoc on my life, but how can I help it not wreak havoc on someone else's? And so that's the ultimate stable, wonderful thing that comes out of it. I know, I won't jump the gun on what Julie was going to say, but just being able to have these discussions is a huge benefit. And, maybe there's something you'll take from this conversation today. You won't even realize it till 5 years from now. I don't know, but just being able to kind of talk about this, it's a topic that I think really needs to be talked about a lot more. And I think one of the things that happens in this generation and people in your age group, I think you kind of talk about it on the surface because it's going on all around you with your peers, but I don't know how in depth, that you're really able to kind of get. And that's kind of what I'm hoping that we can really prompt some more in-depth conversations that just help.
Thank you.
Okay, are there any other questions? We've almost reached the end of our time. The paper that I just passed out to you is from Mr. Shell, and it has information on there about his website and his book, both on there. And also, was there any more questions before I cut you guys off? Any last burning questions that anybody just really wants to ask? Okay, so tomorrow evening at 5 o'clock, let me put this up on the screen. If you are interested in this topic and you want to continue the conversation, tomorrow you can continue talking about this. We have Candid Conversation with David Shell. It's tomorrow, the 19th. It is in a Zoom meeting. Mr. Shell lives in California, so he's enjoying the sunshine and the warmer weather. So you'll have to meet him in a Zoom meeting. The link for this will be on the ReggieNet site, and I'll send it out to you guys in a ReggieNet announcement as well. So if you would like to continue talking about these topics in a more intimate setting, please join him tomorrow evening at 5 o'clock. Forgot to put the time on the slide, but it's at 5 o'clock. And before you all go, let's thank Mr. Shell for meeting with us today. Thank you, David, for talking with us.
You're welcome. Thank you. Julie, do we have a minute to just kind of touch on a question for tomorrow?
Oh, yeah. So David has a question for you guys.
So here's just a kind of preview of kind of things that I'd love to talk about tomorrow. And my printer's down, so I had to kind of scribble some questions. So excuse me for just kind of reading here, but so I have like 2 questions that I really want to kind of, and we can talk about anything else that you want to talk about, but kind of trying to, here's kind of two things that I'd love to know what you think. So kind of one is this, that kind of 50 years ago, few thought divorce was right or good because that's the way that people were raised and that's what kind of society demanded that they think. Now, kind of few think divorce is bad or wrong because that's the way kind of they or you are raised and that's what society demands you think. Do you feel that this statement accurately reflects your generation? Do you know what you think about divorce? Or do you think what you're supposed to think? And that's kind of one of the things I really wanted to kind of talk about in depth is kind of, like I said, just kind of going 4 layers deep in the onion. I think a lot of you guys kind of talk on the surface about what's going on in your lives or your friends' lives. And I think there's society kind of puts some sort of demand on you to kind of think a certain way today, just as it did previously. And so really kind of want to get at, what do you think about divorce? Why do you think the way you think? Do you know what you think? Or like I said, do you think what you feel you're supposed to think? The other thing I wanted to get at in the conversation is that people of all ages make statements regarding divorce that tend to be relative to the divorce itself. Some say, it's better for the kids to see us divorced than it is to see us unhappy together. Or some kids say, I'm glad my parents got divorced because they seem happier now. So these statements are about the parents' level of happiness post-divorce, and they don't reflect the level of happiness kids could have achieved had their parents stayed married. Kind of want to know what you think about that. And so kind of really looking at what's going on in your generation versus what went on in generations previously, and kind of how well do you guys really understand the topic? So that, hope you'll show up tomorrow. And like I said, we can talk about these things. We can talk about anything else. We can, whatever's on your mind to talk about.
I think those are fantastic questions. I'd be interested to know what you guys think as well. So I will be in that Zoom chat tomorrow at 5 o'clock if you guys are interested to share your answers to his questions and what your generation thinks about divorce and marriage, and kind of hear from your age group. That would be great. So thank you again, Mr. Shell, for joining us. We really appreciate it. And hopefully you'll all get to see him tomorrow night as well. Thanks, guys.
Well, you're very welcome, and thanks for having me.